and welcome to my review of the horror film Full Circle. It also includes some behind the scenes trivia. It's a supernatural ghost story that should have been every bit as successful as Rosemary's Baby, as it stars Mia Farrow, together with Keir Dullea and Tom Conti. It also has an impressive supporting artist cast that includes, among others, Julian Fellows, Robin Gamble, Jill Bennett, Catherine Nesbitt, Anna Wing, Anne Mitchell, Peter Sellis and Nigel Havers, to name but a few. The film itself centres around Julia Lofting, played by Mia Farrow, her husband Marcus, played by Keir Dullea, and their daughter Katie, played by young Sophie Ward. Sadly, young Katie dies tragically in a harrowing scene in Julia's arms right at the beginning of the film. Obviously, Julia is devastated by this and goes into hospital to try and recover. When she comes out, she decides to leave her husband and buy a large house in Kensington in London's West End, where she plans to live alone to try and recover from the loss of her daughter. She soon finds out, however, that she isn't quite as alone as she thinks she is. Is someone or something sharing the house with her? Played by visions of a young blonde-haired girl, is it really the ghost of her daughter coming back to haunt her, or is she just going mad? We follow Julia as she tries to piece together a string of events that leads to the truth, leaving a trail of dead bodies in her wake. But who is it that's doing the murders? Is it Julia, or is it something else, more evil and menacing? Full Circle was shot between November and December of 1976. It was made for a budget of $1.1 million. It did well at the Cannes Film Festival in 1977, where it instantly sold to the Netherlands, Canada, the UK and France, where it did particularly well. However, American distributors at the time thought the film would be too slow for an American audience, and so they passed on it. Richard Loncraine then went over to Canada and re-edited the film, dropping quite a few scenes from it and shooting a new one to add in. It didn't get picked up, however, until 1981, when a distributor in America looking for unreleased British horrors came across Full Circle. They did, however, insist on a title change and different artwork for the movie poster, and so in 1981 in America, Full Circle became known as The Haunting of Julia. In 1982, Media Home Entertainment, part of the Heron Group, also released it on VHS for the first time. It was a pan and scan and a reduced aspect ratio and a rather dark print, and so it didn't really do Full Circle the justice it deserved. After a couple of years of being shown at cinemas, it sort of faded into obscurity, being largely forgotten, apart from major horror fans like myself. Obviously, I've loved and adored this film for 47 years. As a young child actor back in 1976, I worked on this film in scenes with Mia Farrow, together with some of my school friends from one of London's top stage schools, the Barbara Speake Stage School in East Acton. I remember vividly the day before getting given a brown envelope at the end of the school day. Normally this meant that you were going on an audition, sometimes you were lucky enough to have a job. I eagerly opened it up to see it said you're working tomorrow on a film titled Full Circle. Wear jeans and a jumper, be at school at 5 a.m. I remember thinking, 5 a.m? I thought getting to school at 9 was bad enough. It used to take me at least an hour and a half to travel to school every day and an hour and a half to travel home. That meant I had to be up at 3 a.m. Well, next morning I was up at 3 a.m. My parents dropped me off at school and we went on location on the minibus. I'll tell you more about the behind the scenes in a little while. The film itself is shot by Peter Hannan, a superb director of photography. His scenes can only be described as exquisite. Shots of Mia as she walks through the mist in the early morning park in London and the sunlight through the trees are simply beautiful. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find a scene in this film that isn't stunning. Peter Hannan recently saw the film and said he wouldn't change a single shot, and I fully agree with him. It's an excellent movie as made. I worked with Peter Hannan again when he was cinematographer on Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, another movie that I worked on, so we kind of went full circle on that one. Equally, the soundtrack in this film is superb. It's by Colin Towns, a highly praised track at the time of its release. It's hauntingly beautiful, which lingers with you long after the film ends. Richard Loncraine, who directed this, was very young when he made it. Indeed, it was only his second film. He has since known to say that it's a mediocre film, and if he'd been given more time, more money, and had more experience, he'd have done a much better job. Personally, I think he's selling both himself and the film a little short there. One of the things I do like about Richard is he is a very humble director. It makes a refreshing change from some who think they're as good best things since sliced bread. Richard joins the ranks of other directors which I think are really highly talented and very good. People like Roland Joffe, Colin Cant and Sarah Sugarman, all of whom are an absolute joy to work with. It's surprising just how important music can be in the making of a movie. Think of the iconic tracks in the James Bond series, for example, or indeed the music used in the film The Long Good Friday. If you replace that track with something else, that film may not have been as successful or as good as it is. Back in 2016, film historian Simon Fitzjohn saw a list of 10 British horrors that had been forgotten about that was printed by the BFI. Simon thought, oh yes, I'll know all of them. He was quite surprised to find that Full Circle was a film he'd never heard of. How have I missed one with Mia Farrow in, he thought. Having tracked down a copy, he instantly fell in love with the film, so much so that he was determined to get it re-released. Simon then tried contacting everybody he could that was involved with the film, myself included. After 7 years of amazingly hard work, the film has, along at last, been re-released. Simon tracked down the original film negative in Technicolor's vaults. It was checked and restored, and that's what the prints that are currently on DVD and Blu-ray are printed from. And so you can now see Full Circle in its best ever sound and picture quality. It really is a very special film. I've got well over 5,000 films in my private collection, and so as a horror fan, I absolutely love Full Circle. Will all horror fans like it? Well, that depends on what kind of horrors you like. I enjoy Universal, Hammer, Amicus, Tygon, Pete Walker, the so-called video nasties back in the 1980s, out through to modern horrors. If you're the kind of horror fan that only likes gallons of blood and gore and jump scares every 2 seconds, then you may not like Full Circle. Yes, there is blood in it, but it's limited and subtle. And there are jump scares in it, but again, they're only where necessary. Interestingly, for a 70s film, there isn't any nudity in this either. What Full Circle does offer, however, is good acting, beautiful soundtrack, fantastic cinematography, and a very eerie and atmospheric film. It's a great film with a nice storyline. And now, for movie buffs, they will have a discussion about some of the deleted scenes, including some more gory ones that were shot on the day that weren't included in the film. Obviously it is 47 years ago, but I remember every single shot that Richard Loncraine and Peter Hannan set up regarding the playground sequence. In fact, I still remember the scene where I had a speaking part in it, and that of 3 of the girls from my stage school, including remembering both my lines and theirs. In the film as you see it now, you'll see a high crane shot of the playground. If you look in the centre of the screen, you'll see Mia Farrow walking from the left-hand side across to the right-hand side towards the park bench. If you look to her left, you'll see a slide with 2 adult actors playing my mum and dad, and a boy running from them going towards the steps of the slide. Well, that boy is me. Originally, that sequence kept on rolling, and you saw me climb up the steps and get to the top of the slide and sit down. There was then a high crane shot close-up of me shouting out, "Hey, Mum, Dad, look at me, I'm coming down." Then we had a ground shot, which was a wide-angle scene of the 2 parents turning to look towards me as I slide down the slide, and then another ground shot close-up of me coming off the slide at the end. Sadly, that didn't make it into the final print. You do, however, still see me in the film 4 times, although it's relegated to basically an extra. When Mia Farrow enters the sandpit, you'll see a boy in the background to her left going round and round on a roundabout, standing up. Well, that sequence lasts about 20 seconds, and that boy is me. Equally, you'll see Mia Farrow take a couple of photographs of children playing in the playground. In the second one that she places down on the bench, you'll see a young boy on the pointy witch's hat roundabout, slightly leaning in. Again, that's me. And again in the background you'll see, when she's sitting on the park bench, some lads playing football. There's one lad that has the ball above his head and throws it to the others. Again, that was me. When Mia stands in the sandpit, you'll see 3 or 4 girls come running together in the background, and you can clearly see that they're talking. Originally in the film we shot a close-up of the girls running together. Their dialogue was, one of the girls says, "What's going on over there?" And the other girl says, "I don't know, I think it's some crazy lady." The third girl says, "I'm going to go over and see." And the other one says, "No, stay here with us, don't go." It's been 47 years, but I still remember that vividly. Equally, Richard Longcrane and Peter Hannan set up various shots which were close-ups of children playing, i.e. the 2 boys on the hobby horse, one of the children on a small swing in the background, other children on the swings in close-up. Equally, there were 2 gory scenes shot. I remember standing next to camera and seeing these being filmed. One was with Samantha Gates from Barbara Speaks Stage School in the sandpit. They'd given her a cardboard box and a scalpel and told us to stab the box. At the time I kind of thought, why is she stabbing a cardboard box? Obviously the box had sage blood in it and it was out of shot. But you saw Samantha basically lifting up the scalpel from the front and stabbing down and lifting it up again with stage blood dripping off the scalpel. Obviously in the film you only see her from behind, you don't see what she's doing, so that bit was deleted from the film. Another gory sequence that they shot was a couple of guys there from the crew had a long syringe filled with stage blood. They were at the back of the sandpit, just out of shot, and there was a rubber tube coming from the long syringe which went along the ground, up underneath Mia's coat and down her sleeve and to her hand where she's holding the tortoise. For some reason a lot of people seem to think it's a turtle when you read comments, but it was definitely a tortoise. We're in the UK after all. That sequence was filmed in wintertime. It was bitterly cold, so much so that when we arrived on location the sandpit was frozen solid, the ground, fence and the bench that you see me sitting in was covered in thick white frost, and playground equipment had a thick layer of ice on it. At the time when they were trying to get the stage blood to squirt out of the syringe, it was that cold that it was freezing in the tube and in the syringe, and they couldn't get it to spray out of the tortoise. So they went off, thinned down the sage blood, and came back after trying to warm it up as well, and another attempt. We tried several times to get that to work. Eventually it did. Sadly, after all that effort, that gory scene of the blood spraying out of the tortoise as she holds it isn't in the film. Equally, when we were shooting the bit where I ran up the steps, they obviously had to change from the high crane shot to the ground shot, which took about 20 minutes of removing the camera off the crane and resetting it up on the ground. During that time I was sitting on top of the slide, bearing in mind it was covered in a thick layer of ice. Richard Longcrane eventually had the shot ready, shouted action, and I attempted to move and found I couldn't. Obviously he shouted cut and said, "Why didn't you move?" I said, "I can't." Richard obviously at the time thought I was messing around and said, "Don't be silly." And I said, "Literally, I can't." I'd been sitting there on the ice for about 20 minutes and had literally frozen to the ice on the slide. 2 of the crew in the end had to come up and literally yank me off. Looking back, I find it quite funny now. At the time it was seriously cold and it wasn't that funny to be sitting there with your bottom getting really cold to the point where I just stuck to the ice. Obviously we went for another take once I was free, and then we got the shot of me coming off at the ground. With the kites covering the slide, you can imagine the speed was pretty impressive, to the point where I shot off the end of the slide and landed about 12 feet on the ground with quite a bump. In fairness, Richard Longcrane instantly came running over and said, "Are you okay?" I got a couple of little scuffs and bruises, but I was okay, and we went for another take. Another sequence in the film is when you see Mia Farrow take her camera out of her bag. It's a Polaroid camera. When we initially went for the take, Mia took the camera out of the bag and couldn't physically open it. Richard shouted cut, and one of the crew members went over to look at it. The props guy realised that the camera had literally frozen shut in her bag. He took it over to a vehicle, opened the bonnet, or hood for American viewers, and had to place it in the engine bay and warm the engine to free off the ice from the camera. He then came back, placed it back into Mia's bag, jumped out of shot. Richard Longcrane shouted action, and in the movie as it is, you'll see her reach into the bag and slightly struggle to open it. That's because it was literally refreezing in her bag again. It was bitterly cold. If you look at the sandpit scene, you'll notice that the wall of the sandpit is very shiny, because it was still covered in a thick layer of ice when it was shot. You'll also notice that the sandpit wall, the rectangular concrete box in the background, and some of the ground next to it is pure white. That's because it was still covered in a thick layer of frost when we were filming that. When you see Mia Farrow's breath coming out in that sequence, it's actually real breath. It's not been CGI'd on. It really was that cold. If any of you are wondering what it was like to work with Mia Farrow, well, she was an absolutely lovely person to work with, and a very kind lady. Obviously, making a movie takes a lot of time. I'd been on location in the freezing cold for around 2.5 to 3 hours. Whilst they were changing cameras from the high crane shot that we'd already filmed back down onto the ground for the tripod shots. Obviously there's various lighting setups that go on, setting up scenes, rehearsals, etc. Being outside, wearing just a thin vest and a jumper and normal shoes and socks, I'd been getting very, very cold, to the point where my hands were burning with pain, as were my toes and my feet. Yes, I was getting frostbite. I'd noticed that Mia Farrow was sitting on a park bench and was staring over towards my direction. She was intensely looking at me. I thought, why is Mia Farrow staring at me? With that, she got up and walked over towards me. As she approached, she said, "Are you all right, little one?" With that, 2 tears uncontrollably ran down my cheeks. She reached out, touched my hand and went, "Oh my God, you're freezing. Come with me." She took me by the hand and we walked over and sat down on the park bench together. With that, she opened the big brown coat that you see her wearing in the film, wrapped it in her arm around me and cuddled up to try and keep me warm. She then asked why I hadn't got a coat on. I'd explained that obviously when I'd arrived I was just wearing my school blazer. I presumed we were going to be filming in studio, and obviously wasn't aware that we were outside because I hadn't been told. So, obviously Richard Longcrane didn't want me wearing the school blazer. I'm guessing he probably thought that the scene might have been set at a weekend and it would have looked odd, but that the wardrobe van hadn't brought enough coats. Obviously, Mia and I sat there chatting for a little while, as Peter Hannan and the director Richard Longcrane had their backs to us and were standing over by the swings, discussing about setting up the next scenes. After a little while, Richard walked over towards us. He gave me a quizzical look, must have been thinking, why is this little boy sitting next to Mia, and then said to Mia Farrow, "Are you ready to do your next scene?" Both Richard Longcrane and myself were quite taken aback when she turned around abruptly and said, "No, I'm not." I was sat there thinking, why? Obviously, Richard Longcrane asked why. She said, "Why hasn't this little boy got a coat? It's not good enough. It's absolutely freezing." Obviously, Richard Longcrane didn't know what to say. He called the wardrobe girl over and she'd explained that on the day they'd left in a hurry. They hadn't checked the call sheet to see how many children were on the shoot, and they'd only loaded 8 coats. There were around 12 or 13 of us on the shoot, so they didn't have enough. Richard then said, "Is it right if Keith goes and sits with," I think her name was Susan, over in the wardrobe van? Obviously, Mia said no, because then when he comes back out on set, he still won't have a coat and he'll still be cold, and that isn't good enough. So, Richard Longcrane then sent the wardrobe girl off to try and find a shop to buy a coat that would fit a 12-year-old boy. Mia Farrow refused to work until she'd returned, and told Richard Longcrane to sit next to me. I must admit, Richard didn't say an awful lot to me initially. I think he was a little bit sort of embarrassed because of what had gone on. Mia and I chatted for a while, and then Richard started to as well. The wardrobe girl had been gone for a good 3/4 of an hour before she came back. She explained that she'd gone to look for a shop locally that sold children's clothing, but she couldn't find one. She then literally resorted to knocking on dozens and dozens of houses in the local area, explaining they were a film crew and that she needed to borrow a coat that would fit a 12-year-old boy. Obviously, eventually finding a couple that were kind enough to do so. Richard said, make sure that the coat is returned, thank them very much and give them some money for doing it. Obviously, once Mia had put the coat on me, she still refused to work until she was happy that I'd warmed up, and then she went back to doing so. For a major Hollywood star to do something like that for a young child actor that she'd only just met on set, and indeed the first time we'd had the occasion to talk was when she came over to me, was absolutely amazing. I've never forgotten the kindness that Mia Farrow did for me on that day. It really was a lovely gesture. And for a big movie star, a very, very impressive thing to do. I would like to thank everybody who's ever watched Full Circle and who likes it or loves it as much as I do. If you haven't seen it and you're going to buy one of the BFI imprint or Screen Factory versions, then I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of myself, my fellow cast and crew. I often interact with fans of different productions that I've worked on over the years, like Grange Hill, Doctor Who, Monty Python's Meaning of Life, etc. And so if you'd like to leave a comment, then I promise I'll get back to you. Before I end, I would like to point you in the direction of a film called A Beautiful Terror, The Haunting of Julia. It's made by filmmaker Dennis Cahlo in the United States. Dennis is a major fan of this film, so much so that he's put together a beautiful documentary about Full Circle. Obviously in America it's known as The Haunting of Julia, hence his title. I really can't praise that highly enough. I absolutely loved his work and really enjoyed it. Currently it's got about 18,000 views, and so if you're interested then take a look on YouTube. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this review and some of the behind the scenes trivia about the deleted scenes and the making of the movie. If so, then hopefully join me next week when we'll be reviewing another movie in this series. So until then, see you soon. Film historian Simon Fitzjohn came across a list for... again. Shit, 3, 2, 1.
And truly that is what great horror does. It stays with you long after the credits roll.